Good evening. My name is Diane Stevens, and I am your co-host along with.
Vida Paculita.
And this evening, Vida and I are going to be hosting Dr. Julia Rucklidge, and she's here all the way from New Zealand. But we wanted to first tell you that this particular this is going to be recorded. So if you have to have replay, we are going to have a replay. But Vida and I have helped people in the UK and around the world with options for and guidelines for supplementation, micronutrients for many years in the prevention and well-being category. So it's what we call a safe way of giving people options and guidelines to incorporate into their daily life, into their lifestyle, and support them effectively. What we wanted to do was share this evening with all of you that this is not going to be a book club type of presentation, but we have a varied audience that's going to be watching this. So we're going to keep to the topics of very foundational information because we want you all to get the book. We want you to get the book because it's a valuable resource for so many reasons. And it's for prevention, it's for discussion with your healthcare provider, it's education, it's knowledge, it empowers you to improve your own life and the lives of those in your family. But most importantly, what nutrients do inside your brain and how you're more likely to make changes and improve what you eat and what you do in your overall daily life. So Julia and Bonnie, they are the co-authors of The Better Brain, and their studies are quite profound. The proof of this is not just in all of the clinical studies that they've done on mental health symptoms, but also improved sleep, improved mood, people's need for stimulants like alcohol, recreational meds and drugs, cigarettes, that sort of thing. They find that it's easier to cope with the daily life stresses when you've incorporated nutrition at a very nourishing level into your life. So it's a gift for us to spend time with Dr. Julia Rucklidge this evening. And like I said, she and Bonnie are the co-authors and have dedicated their careers to researching how nutrients impact the brain health. So diet and nutritional support really do matter. We're going to have Julia introduce herself, but there is one thing she may not share, but we're going to do that. So, Vida.
Yeah, and Dr. Julia has been a recipient of many awards, plus being named as a woman of influence in New Zealand in 2015, 2018, and in 2021. And Braveheart Award for her contribution to make Christchurch a better place to live. So we want to thank you, Julia, for this and for all your work. And please introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be able to do this. I'm in the UK just for a few weeks, and I love to be able to have that opportunity to connect with the local community. So I'm really, really pleased that this was able to happen. So thank you for the introduction and also for highlighting some of the key things from the Better Brain. I'm very I can see some names of people, but if people want to show their faces, I find that so much nicer to be able to engage with who's my audience and who's out there. So I know sometimes people don't want to do that, so that's fine too. But if you can turn your videos on, then there we go. That's then I know who I'm speaking to. It sometimes it feels like you're just kind of chatting and to anyway, much better. Hi there. So I'm a professor of clinical psychology, which is somewhat surprising to sometimes for people to hear because it's a book really about nutrition and about food. And so how is it possible that a psychologist can have any level of expertise in this area? And to be honest, when I started off in my training as a clinical psychologist, I didn't know a lot about food. In fact, my training taught me that it wasn't very relevant to the brain, and that really the best ways to address mental health problems in our community are through psychotherapy and medication. And that was back in the 1990s. And sadly, that continues to be pretty much the message that we get, is that if you are struggling with depression, or you're struggling with ADHD, you're struggling with anxiety, that the places to go is to go to talk to your GP, and inevitably they will likely put you on a medication. I know medications are the rate of medications in the UK is stunningly high. I think it would be around 20, I don't know if this is accurate, around 20% of adult population are on an antidepressant. It's somewhere high. It is somewhere
It's
around
high.
there. It's high.
Yeah.
And so, and that's an extraordinary number to think that a fifth of the population is taking an antidepressant, especially knowing that they do come with side effects, knowing that the data are not as stunning as we would love them to be. We would obviously love it that people went on antidepressants and felt better. But my experience over the last 20 years is that many people don't get well. So I think we need to acknowledge that we're not helping enough people. We need to say, yes, absolutely, they have a place, but I think there's some other really big things, that lifestyle factors that we can address that may go further than antidepressants. So anyway, going back to my training, I did this trained as a clinical psychologist, trained how to do talking therapies. And soon after I finished my training, I moved to New Zealand in 2000 and started an academic position. So I didn't do a lot of clinical psychology per se in the one-to-one kind of sense, but got involved in doing research. And so when I was doing my PhD with Bonnie Kaplan, so I did my PhD under her, she heard about families from southern Alberta, Canada, and I was out in Calgary at the time, and she heard about these families who were using nutrients to treat some very serious psychiatric problems like psychosis, like bipolar disorder, depression. And of course, these were, are viewed as very serious conditions that if you were to go see a mental health professional, they would think that you need to be medicated if you're struggling with those problems. But these families had found and discovered that they could use nutrients. It changed over the years, but currently they use nutrients in a pill, mostly in a pill form. There's some powder forms as well. Vitamins and minerals, nothing special about them in the sense that there's no one single nutrient that is a cure for any condition. We often think that, you hear about zinc will treat ADHD, or vitamin D will treat depression, et cetera, et cetera. But for the most part, you'd be pretty lucky if it was just one nutrient and could solve all your problems, because the brain needs the full array of vitamins and minerals in order to function optimally. So it doesn't take long before you could, if you start to delve, and this is something that's what we really talk about a lot in the book, is to help people understand what the vitamins and minerals do.
Yeah.
And that they play an incredibly important role in making neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, which are things that I know lots of people have heard of because of antidepressants. We've heard of serotonin because of the SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So there are things that people are familiar with, but what people don't know, really, really sadly, is that what we don't know widely is that vitamins and minerals are essential to make neurotransmitters. And that's something that's not taught in school. It's not taught as general education to the public, and it's certainly not taught on the food packaging that I have spent I've been, looking at over the last 3 days since I got back to the UK, and it's not there. There's nothing there that's telling you what you should eat for brain health. So sorry, I tend to go down all these rabbit holes and trying to explain who I am, which is your
No,
question.
this is good. This is good though. That's good.
So I heard about these. So going back to these families who were using nutrients, by the time I moved to New Zealand, I was no longer naive and thinking that we were solving mental health problems with just psychotherapy and or medications. And so I heard these stories, my training had told me nutrition wasn't relevant. These families were telling Bonnie that they were getting well and staying well with nutrients. Bonnie did some small clinical trials in the later part of 1990s, early 2000s, documenting people getting better with these nutrients and also allowing for a lower dose of medication. But I thought, well, it's worth studying. Here I am in New Zealand. I'm a scientist. I'm a researcher. This is our job. Our job is to be what we call the critics and conscience of society, which is to study ideas that may contravene the current way of thinking. You won't make progress, and we'll never find new discoveries if you don't sometimes challenge yourself and also challenge the current paradigm.
Yeah.
So that is what I did, and that's what Bonnie did. But Bonnie really struggled to do the research in Canada. It took me moving to New Zealand to be able to do the research that really needed to be done. There was too much influence of big pharma in Canada and in the US for them to be able to seriously do it. I moved to Christchurch. It's a small city on the South Island, 300,000 people. And there's not as much influence of big pharma in New Zealand. It's a small country, 5 million. We're just not important enough, and it's not worth it in terms of market value. So I just started doing the trials to see whether or not the nutrients might have make a difference. It wasn't easy to do around some of the barriers and and having to jump through hoops and things like that. But it really, the barriers really started when I started to find that they were making a difference. And that's when I started to have even greater resistance to doing the research. But that's a long story in itself. So there I was, critic and conscience of society, wanting to do this research, thinking it's worth, either finding that the nutrients can help people or find that they don't help people, in which case that's an important thing to know as well. And the first clinical trials really did show some really stunning effects for some people. Not everybody, not everyone responds to this, but some people really had just a complete reversals in their psychiatric symptoms and getting really well, and not just in the sort of symptoms that we were targeting, but it was also in other areas, like their sleep would get better, or they didn't need to drink as much. Their dependency on alcohol seemed to go down, and they were more regulated in their moods, and they were better. I think one of the things that we observed really early on was they were more resilient and better able to cope with life's stressors, because let's face it, life has got stressors. We're never going to be able to eliminate them. We certainly know that from the last couple of years, that there's a lot that gets sent our way that we have to cope with. And I think being well nourished makes sure that your fuel tank is always full, or I should change that paradigm to your electric charge is full. And that's you can have the best car, but if your battery is flat, you're not going to be able to go anywhere. And so you can have the best brain, but if you don't feed it adequately and give it the nutrients it needs, then it's just going to be foggy and slow, and you're going to have low energy, and you're not going to be able to sort of deal with the things that get thrown at you. So how am I doing, Diane, on answering your question?
You're doing well, because what you've done is you've taken and shown that what people want to do in society. Like, even when everybody always says to us, well, if my doctor says, but what we know is that the doctor doesn't have enough education in nutrition, like you as a clinical psychologist, but by your whole training, the amount of education that they're given on nutrition is so tiny that I always have, I have a friend that was a chief of staff of a hospital in Texas. And he said, you help me understand prevention and micronutrients so that I can better help my patients for prevention
Mm.
because we don't get trained. And I think that
Yeah.
you taking that and flipping that and saying, well, if nutrition in what we eat, what we absorb in our micronutrients makes that big of a difference, then let me prove it. If it doesn't prove true, then take the medication
Yeah,
or help yourself along
exactly.
with other prescriptions, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so I went in with a very open, curious stance. Didn't expect them to have the effect that they were going to have, although I had heard of stories from Bonnie, and Bonnie is someone who I respect greatly. And if she says, do you need to take this seriously? Then you take it seriously, because she'd been a researcher. I mean, she's now retired, but she had been a researcher for 30 years at that point. So she really, she knew the ins and outs of things that can work and things that can't work. And so to hear her say, you need to take it seriously. So I thought, why not?
Yeah. We have
Yeah.
to say, I'm going to interject there because Vita and I do know the family that she interviewed in the 90s. We know that family and we know the success of what happened, which is out of a tragic story of suicide of a mother, and seeing the children have the same genetics, several of the children, and to see how micronutrients made a huge, that is a huge impact on such a drastic level. I mean, we fight every day with stressors, right? Chronic stress, that's what inflammation, all of those things. But in this case, this is so profound. All of your studies that we've looked at of the different conditions, let alone just, general stress, it's profound.
Well, I think what we've discovered through doing the research with different conditions is that it's not a treatment for a specific mental health disorder. No. And it's a, I think metabolic tune-up is something that Bruce Ames often talks about as, I think he's still alive, so he probably still talks that way, but he's getting very old. But it's just the idea that we need to make sure that we adequately feed the brain all the nutrients, and then it can run. So it's like putting fuel in the fuel tank, and your car will do what it needs to do, and it'll operate exactly the way it's been made to operate. And that's the same thing with the brain, is that if you don't provide it with the fuel, then it's going to be slow and sluggish. And everybody has experienced that and understands that and has seen it and observed it firsthand. We've all, witnessed people who are really struggling with the brain not being able to operate the way it should. So we've been, I think we're at a really interesting point. Maybe interesting isn't the right word, but we're at a point in history where we've had the colliding of big pharma with big food, and it's a really it's a really devastating it's been incredibly devastating for our health, in the sense that we've got the food industry coming up with these, I hate calling them foods because they're not nourishing, but coming up with these products that we eat and we think that they're fine, and we think they're going to provide us with what we need in terms of calories and macronutrients, but they're simply not adequately giving us with the vitamins and minerals. And again, just going to the book, that's what we wanted to educate the public about, was that you really need to care about it. I mean, I wish I had a package here, but being in the UK, but I've been looking at them, and on the front of the package, it's got you got this traffic light system on all the packages. In fact, from what I can tell, it's on everything. And the traffic light system is telling you about what is basically not in the food. So it's telling you that it's low in, it's telling you the energy level, and people are kind of trained to think they need it to be low, and the calories, and it saturates, and it's got something about salt. There's something in there about sugar, and I'm trying to remember what the last one is. Energy. Okay. And so there, and that's it. And that's all the food industry tells us about our food. And you think, why should I care about what's not in here? I want to know what's in here. Like I'd like to know what's in here to feed me well. So it's, as I always, I tell people, a cardboard box would probably get a full green star, green light rating, because it's low in salt and sugar and low in saturates and fats and calories, but that doesn't mean you should eat it. So it's stunning that we've bought into this, and we think that this is a reasonable way to sell food to the entire population of the UK. How did that happen? Because the industry is incredibly powerful, and we've just, been led astray. I think we've been led astray, and our politicians aren't helping us. So,
and people are not questioning it. Actually, they are not.
No,
they are happy with what it is.
Well, that's the interesting thing, is that I think because I'm not a dietitian and because I'm not a nutritionist, I looked at it with just full naivete. I'm looking at the food packages and going, is this for real? Like, is this really?
But that's good. That's good that needs to change.
Yeah, it does need to change. And I think we talked a little bit about it in the book, like the traffic light system. I think that, because in New Zealand, we have a star rating system. So it's very similar, very, very similar. Whereas in the States, there's nothing like that. They tend to just focus on the fats, calories, fats and carbs and proteins and calories. So the concept of me thinking that minerals and vitamins are important to us is really foreign. And the information is simply not there on the packages to help us navigate that, because you'd never know what is going to be high in vitamins and minerals. And even if they do provide you with a bit of that information, the amount of those nutrients, those micronutrients in most foods is incredibly small, unless you were eating your real whole foods. But even then, that information isn't provided on the packages. So you just don't know where to find these nutrients. There's nothing there to help us navigate our way through. So it's really sad. So that's the one thing, is the big food. And then we, around the same time as us embracing these ultra processed products, we ended up with these drugs that essentially compensated for what the food isn't giving us. And so the food isn't giving you the vitamins and minerals that you need to make to support your mitochondria, to support your, keeping your genes healthy, for fighting inflammation, for making neurotransmitters, etc. And then we've got these drugs that we give people to try to correct the problem created by the food. So we're giving people these SSRIs that correct the fact that you're not our bodies don't have the ingredients in order to make the neurotransmitters to the level that we need them at, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then, we give people things like statins to try to address the issues associated with inflammation, and it just goes on and on and on. And so, and we aren't really questioning the fundamental problem, which is that our food environment is a complete mismatch for humans at the moment. So,
and that's why we get the questions. People are like, well, I thought I was eating well. I thought I was eating well. And that goes back to, well, you thought you were. And we see that in a lot of our corporate wellness. I thought I was, but you don't know. You're, like you say, your grandmother's peach, right?
Exactly.
You're not eating your grandmother's peach. If you taste a tomato now, it doesn't taste like one when I grew up.
Exactly.
The taste, the flavor isn't even there, which means we know that the nutrients aren't in there because they don't taste the way they used to. And I think that's a big thing as to why the micronutrients are so key to, it's not even filling in the gaps anymore. It's not even that. It's not, micronutrients aren't filling in the gaps anymore. They're really there to support the things that we just can't get anymore. The environment's creating issues, our lifestyle's creating issues, and there's so many things that are compounding what we're trying to put in. But like you said before, Julia, people don't even eat 5 servings of fruit and veg, and that's a minimum.
Yeah, I know, exactly. And so what you're also raising, I mean, the whole issue that even if we were to try to eat well, it's harder, much harder to do that these days.
Yeah.
And you know, the reason why our food is less nourishing these days has got to do with a lot of different complexity around our the way we farm, the changes in agricultural procedures over time. We don't let the soil rest anymore. We do a lot of monoculture produce, you know, just one specific plant or in a field, and just keep harvesting that over and over again. And so it depletes the soil of the minerals that are where you're mostly going to get the minerals are from the soil.
So the variety is not there, is it? The variety is not there either. And because people don't get variety, they don't get the right portions. They don't even get really nutrient dense food. All these things are compounding that, which kind of leads us into that whole gut brain axis thing, because that is, we see that a lot. And I know you had some really good questions in the book, because we want to kind of tease on the book, because we want people to use this as a resource tool and to join our discussion groups and be a part of that, to be able to help their brain, help their body, their gut, the whole encompassing approach. But we think this is such a valuable tool to everybody.
Yeah.
But talk to us about that whole gut piece, because there's hormones in the gut that are telling the brain.
Yeah. So it's been really, I mean, this is one thing that's been really exciting about being involved in this kind of research over the last decade, because the field is really expanding and exploding, and in particular when it comes to the microbiome. And so as a psychologist, again, going back to that, a psychologist, I think people are attracted to psychology is that they don't have to deal with things like the microbiome and you know, they can just sort of think that they're focused on the brain.
Yeah.
But I've certainly learned over the last 10 years that as a psychologist, you really need to care about the health of the gut, because there's the gut really does play a massive role in how healthy your brain is. So there's, for those of you who don't know, that there's a lot of communication that goes on between the gut and the brain, and it does that through a variety of different channels. One of them is through the nervous system, through the vagus nerve. Another one is through the HPA axis, which is the hormonal system that you're talking about, Diane, and also through it is what there's one more, and it's kind of escaping me at the moment. It'll come back to me through the immune system. There you go. So so there's different ways that you can communicate, either directly or indirectly, through what's released. And what is remarkable and really important is that what the health of your gut influences how permeable your gut lining is. And so some foods really seem to inflame that gut lining and have a negative effect on it. And it creates what's being called a leaky gut. And the leaky gut just means that the junctures are looser, that sort of are you know, sort of supporting the gut and keeping it tight. They end up being a little bit looser, so that things can sort of slip through and get into the bloodstream and cause havoc all over your body. And what we do know is that the types of things that seem to cause this kind of problems with the gut lining are your ultra-processed foods. And so they can really play a role in the health of your gut. And so people hear about things like gluten or dairy, that they seem to, some people really react to them. I'm not always convinced that those are the things that are the problem. I think there are other things in the foods associated with gluten that could also be triggers. Like when you eat gluten, you're also often eating preservatives, emulsifiers, food colors. You know, so it goes with a whole host of other things, but you're also consuming glyphosate. And so, which is, you know, a herbicide, which is, that's used, sadly, I think, everywhere. And is all over our crops. And so that is being identified as something that seems to have an effect on the bacteria. and it's still really early days, because the people who sell glyphosate, they sell it saying it's safe for humans. It doesn't. Yes, it can kill plants, but it doesn't kill humans because it targets a certain pathway that humans don't have. But the microbiome has it. The bacteria have that specific pathway. The shikam, I'm trying to remember how you pronounce it, but it's a Japanese word, shikamate pathway. If anybody else knows how to pronounce it, do let me know. But
Japanese, anybody?
yeah,
No.
so but that is the pathway that we know is affected by glyphosate, and that is what leads to the killing of the specific weeds. But it's also known that it may have an effect on the microbiome, but that's really still early days. So there's a whole host of things that could be triggering your microbiome to be unhealthy and to be in a irritated state. And when that happens, then you end up with a whole bunch of gut issues. You don't end up with it affects the communication that's going on with the brain, et cetera, et cetera. So it can cause inflammation through the immune system. So you end up with in a place where you're inadequately able to get vitamins and minerals out of your food. And so that can be one of the downsides of that too. So even if you start to try to change your diet, it can take a while before you can heal that gut lining. And
that's because the food's not absorbing. You're probably eating so many micronutrients and macronutrients, but still you're having gut issues because it just can't. It's nothing's absorbing because you're not getting it in there.
Yeah.
So there has to be other ways to be able to nourish yourself that it doesn't have to, that it can bypass the gut. And we've been using some interesting things with that, but we'll talk about that another time. But you know what I thought was really interesting, Julia, is what you put in the book. And this is from Hippocrates. All diseases begin in the gut. And that was 460 to 370 BCE.
Yeah, the idea of, again, these are not new ideas, and so it's always stunning to think that we're talking about them and kind of revisiting them as if they are new, when they really aren't. And I am always the first one to say that this is not my idea. These are not. I've just been the scientist who decided to put it back on. I call it putting back on the map.
That's what you're doing. Yes.
Yeah, that's all we're doing is and I think this is how humans do this. We cycle through different ideas, and something becomes a fad. I think we were talking about that earlier, actually, fashionable, and then it's out of fashion. And so we're just we're just always recycling, and we're just, we need to remind ourselves of the importance of food in our health. And we've just been diverted from that as a consequence of what I was saying before, which I think is just the collision of big pharma with big food.
You know what I find interesting, and I have some clients that are on here that do take this, but people don't really understand that they're taking a lot of probiotics like out there, and we found out that there are a special class of probiotics which deliver mental health benefits to individuals. They're called psychobiotics, and they're different from the conventional probiotics. So a lot of people don't realize that there's a special class of psychobiotics to give a little bit of support.
I don't know if they're exactly a different class as such. The term psychobiotic came from John Cryan and Ted Deenan at Cork University in Ireland. And they were more reflecting on the specific strains of bacteria that seem to have an effect on mental health. So they coined that term psychobiotic to just refer to their properties of being able to improve mental health. But I don't think they're necessarily different from what might be bacteria that be important for your physical health. So it's not like they're a special class, but they are specific strains that have been identified to have hopefully positive effects on your mental health. But it's still a really in its infancy around using the psychobiotics. I kind of like to think about it in the same way as I think about the micronutrients. The scientists have been doing research with just like one strain, or maybe two strains, but not like a broad spectrum of bacterial strains. And so the research is really patchy in that there's some studies that show some benefit and then other ones don't. I did a study, well, a former PhD student of mine, Amy Romaine, actually, she's in where is she? Swansea University in the UK. She did her PhD with me in New Zealand, and she looked at probiotics for the treatment of depression, and we didn't find any benefit of the probiotics strains over the placebo. So we had people obviously benefiting, but there was no difference. But other researchers have found differences. So it's what I'm saying is it's patchy. It's like some people see it and then other people don't replicate it, and so we're ending up learning that the probiotic story is still, we've got a long way to go, and it may improve if we combined more strains, just like we did with the micronutrients. Is that we weren't finding one nutrient was being effective, but you put them all together, and that's when you had the real synergy and the much larger effects than we'd seen with any one single nutrient. And it wasn't like it was additive; it was really, really was much bigger than the sum of the parts. So
it makes sense
with the probiotics or the psychobiotics.
It does make sense then, doesn't it, that more research in what combination, and if they hit the gut live. I mean, I think that's one thing, if they hit the gut live.
Yes, and there's a lot of, exactly.
Right.
And again, and that is something that
a variable
is one that it is a variable. And does it have to be refrigerated? You kind of think, well, the gut isn't a refrigerated.
No.
So why would they only live if they're refrigerated? It makes you kind of think that, so there's,
I think, the easiest, maybe we have to change the soil. Maybe the nourishment of the soil has to be changed. We start from the basics, and then gut will be fine. Because it's receiving too many chemical compounds that it can't deal with.
Exactly. But we're also, I mean, that what you're raising there is really an important issue, which is that we are killing our soil, and we're killing the microbiome of our soil, and we're not tending to the microbiome of the soil. We're just adding all of these pesticides and herbicides that are having a really negative effect on the microbiome of our soil. And so that is something that I know people are really starting to take seriously. Like regenerative agriculture is becoming quite a sort of a term that more and more I hear more and more people talking about. And that is where you're really trying to figure out what are the really important ingredients that are present in order for us to have a healthy soil. And so that's something that people are starting to really take seriously, which is good, because we've got, as I was saying before, that there's been some pretty substantial changes to the way we do agriculture these days. And we're not replenishing, we're not adequately putting full minerals back in. But even then, some people would argue, well, is that really the right way, is to have to fertilize? Are there other ways, like, can't we use natural fertilizers, et cetera? So there's a lot of debates that are going on around how to get a really healthy soil. And whether or not these things that we're using on the plants to help them, to fend off the weeds, is that really being a good thing? It serves one purpose, but it creates a whole bunch of other problems. So we select foods that grow really quickly, and in growing them really quickly, then you don't have the same opportunity to bring the minerals out of the soil. So there's a whole host of things. Climate change, the heating up of the planet increases carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That can help the plants grow quicker. But again, the research shows that reduces the amount of minerals that are available in the plant. So we've got a whole bunch of things that are really working against us at the moment around being able to adequately feed our brains, even if you eat really well, as according to our grandparents. And that's why we talk a lot about in the book about why for some people supplementation may be the only way that they can achieve good health, because there's so many things that are working against them.
Well, we've noticed these are a lot of our questions lately, Julia,
Yeah.
and it has to do with a lot of your studies that I know you've done on stress, but
Mhm.
it's almost like the last several years, what people are seeing that's compounded over the last several years, the questions that have come up in the last, I don't know, 8 months have been, Diane, what do you have for brain fog, for my memory, my focus? It isn't as sharp. There's
Mhm.
these questions, but the more I look at and the more that I read in the book, chronic inflammation, inflammation has a double-edged sword, doesn't it? Like you said, and there's chronic inflammation, and that then creates all these issues when it comes to our brains use so much energy each day that we really have to feed the brain so that everything else is working. But
Mhm.
it's become an issue lately. Stress and chronic inflammation, chronic, a lot of things, life challenges has been an issue lately. And I think your studies on stress
Mhm.
are quite, almost like some people feel like they have PTSD, like they're afraid now. They're more fearful. Those are a lot of things that are cropping up.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're again at a point in history where I was saying earlier that we are faced with a lot more challenges. I don't think, one thing that we say in the book is that we don't think that there's any more challenges now than our ancestors have faced. We're
Yeah.
not, unless, most of us are not, particularly in the UK, you're not faced with war
Exactly.
or famine, or massive natural disasters and other things that can really have plagued our ancestors. So, but we do have our fair share of things that are going on. But I really, going back to what I said before, I think our resilience has really dropped. And that's something that we proved, and we really showed it with the studies that we did after the earthquakes in Christchurch, a flood in Alberta, Canada, and then a mosque shooting that happened again in Christchurch, sadly. So the city that I live in has really given us a lot of opportunities to learn about the effects of stress and what helps people become more resilient. And one of my favorite studies and publications was actually one that was done just after one of the very first big earthquakes that we experienced, where we just happened to have people who were taking nutrients as a consequence of where they were in a study, one of our research studies. And then there were some people who happened to not be taking the micronutrients because they hadn't started, or they had finished in a study and had decided to stop. So we tracked down as many people as we could after that earthquake to see whether we could answer the question, which was, if you happen to be taking micronutrients at the time of an earthquake, did that help you recover? So that was the question that we were able to ask. And we were just in that kind of lucky position, if you want to call it lucky, that we could explore that because of this experiencing this earthquake, and then the thousands of aftershocks that came afterwards. So we were able to show that people who happen to be taking micronutrients, which is essentially making sure your fuel tank is full, they recovered much more quickly. They got anxious. Everyone got anxious. It was just absolutely terrifying. I don't know if anybody here has ever been in an earthquake. I don't think the UK certainly doesn't have its fair share of
Lucky,
earthquakes.
we're lucky here.
But New Zealand is the shaky isles for a reason, and it's a terrifying thing to go through, and especially if you're high up in a building and things are crashing around you, which is what happened in the February earthquakes. So they're terrifying. So it's not to say that you don't get stressed, but people just recovered a lot more quickly if they were taking additional nutrients. And the irony is that if you are in a natural disaster or something terrible happens, you tend to seek out foods that are comforting, that are higher in sugar, and that aren't necessarily nourishing for your brain. So that's something that's certainly very well known, that that we reach for those foods. And again, that makes sense from our ancestors. If they were stressed, they needed that extra energy to actually flee something. So it does serve a purpose, but we have it in abundance, and we eat far too much of it now. So, and we don't need to flee tigers anymore. So,
would you say that the pandemic, the last 2 years of the dealing with trauma of a pandemic, is it somehow similar to the stresses that people, experienced with all with
yeah,
really dramatic trauma?
I don't think that we've got this incredible system that has evolved to keep us safe and to help us survive the fight flight response. So it is a stunning, system that kicks in when a stressor comes along. But it is sometimes you could think about it as a overactive smoke alarm system that goes off even with things that aren't going to kill you or that you have to run away from. So it's a system that makes sure that ensures our survival, but it does get triggered by any kind of stressor. And I think most people are pretty familiar with that concept, that the fight flight response gets triggered really easily by things that aren't things that you need to be physically afraid of, but your boss can trigger it, or a pandemic can trigger it, or obviously the earthquakes are going to trigger that, and that in that instance you do need to get to safe place quickly. So but the pandemic will have definitely triggered that for people. So our bodies don't distinguish between these different stressors particularly well. So so you just end up constantly triggering the fight flight response. You get the release of adrenaline, you make cortisol, you just flooding the system with these hormones that are important for keeping us alive, but it's at the detriment of the rest of everything else. So your ability to regulate your sleep, or regulate anxiety, or regulate your mood, they are compromised because, again, I always think of nutrition as being finite. And so you've got a finite resource. It's going to go to what is going to ensure your survival, at the expense of things that only need the nutrients for long-term function. So it doesn't matter if you're unable to concentrate or the way you need to in a work environment, because what we need to make sure is that you get out of a situation that is supposed to be life-threatening. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's just to think about it, that these stressors deplete us, and they're nutrient hungry, and that they will take the nutrients at the expense of everything else. And so no wonder we're exhausted after several years of this just depletion that's been going on. And I certainly see it in so many people around that, just that lack of motivation and low energy and fatigue and brain fog. And so I
that's
think
why we have to stay more and more. It's not just to prepare the body for everyday stress, to combat it. So just to make sure we eat well.
Correct. Exactly. We need to make sure that we are feeding our brains well. Yeah.
It's the mental resilience. It goes back to mental resilience, so that you have the ability to be coping, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Vida, do you have one more question?
I really enjoy reading the part which is it's subject I'm not very familiar, but mental health. More of your research on ADHD, your work. So it's just in general, all the mental health issues, and let's say micronutrients, how it can help. But just in general, people are thinking, oh, maybe micronutrients we have to take only if we have certain, mental health issue. But general public needs to focus on, if they're not eating well, to enhance their diet or introduce some kind of supplements in general. because of what we talked, the soil not being nourished enough, so the food is not providing the nutrients the brain and body needs.
Do you have a question? I'm not sure I followed what the question was.
Do you think,
no,
Vida,
we talked about that Diane, actually, about
that people try to, here's what happens people always say to us, well, I saw on the TV, blah, 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 blah. Well, yes, we know that, but with micronutrients, you don't use them in isolation. And I think that's a story. And this is really what we want people to understand and learn from your book. And so they can join our discussion group and actually dig in a bit deeper, that these things they see on the TV or that are in the newspaper today, and this is it, but they're single nutrient studies, or the scaremonger studies. This one, da 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 da. There again, it's a single nutrient study, isn't it? That's been done. And what you have researched is how broad spectrum micronutrients, knowing that you're not affiliated with any company. We know that, Julia, because you're to work at a university and you do all sorts of research. I mean, the hundreds of clinical studies that you've done is amazing. And we are grateful and thankful for that. But we get that whole, well, I'm taking zinc. Well, I'm taking vitamin D. And then the whole broad spectrum, people, I think, miss the point that things have to work together in the right blend, in the right synergistic ratios and proportions in order to meet the needs of the brain, and the brain feeds the body. Also, there's targeted nutrition, but understanding that broad spectrum is what you have really, really found is critical.
Definitely. I mean, definitely that's the concept that we have studied. Bonnie and I have both studied that and haven't really delved too much into the single nutrients. Although sometimes some of our studies do include a single nutrient as a comparator. So, for example, at the flood study, we used a vitamin D comparator, and it did not do as well as the broad spectrum or B complex. B complex is actually has been shown to be really useful for stress, and so you don't necessarily need the broad spectrum under stress, although the caveat I would say there is that our research does show that people who were provided or randomized to the group that received the full array of vitamins and minerals did even better than the people who just got the B vitamins. But we did see really quite stunning results with the B vitamins, and somewhat surprisingly, at least from my perspective, because I thought the broad spectrum was the only way to go. But then there's also other researchers who have shown the same thing, that the B vitamins do seem to be able to support people under stressful circumstances. And I suppose the good news there is that B vitamins are easier to come by. There's a lot of complexes out there, B vitamin complexes that can be easily obtained, as opposed to the broad spectrum, but that can sometimes be a bit harder to source it.
The other thing that we notice in people is that we are what we absorb, right? We are what we absorb. So they can take, we see
bioavailability.
The bioavailability. They take this. I took this, off the supermarket shelf. Well, we know that you're just going to excrete that, and it's going to go in the toilet because we've seen it over and over and over. So we do help people to understand that it's got to be usable in the body and absorb to get the benefit.
And we've definitely proven that with the broad spectrum nutrients that we've been studying, is that we've done blood nutrient levels, and we know that they go up. B12, particularly vitamin D, goes up. So, and some other ones, some don't change because of the tight homeostasis that exists in our system, that you want to keep some nutrients under really tight control, so that if either you'll take things out of, say, the bones, to make sure that you always have a sort of a really tightly controlled amount of calcium in the blood. So some nutrient levels don't change, but some of them do, and that does confirm for us that something's going on. But one of the exciting things, few things that we've done in my lab that really do show that the nutrients are doing something. One of them was where we looked at to see whether or not it had the nutrients could affect methylation. And methylation is something that like looking at whether or not DNA has got methyl groups on it or not.
Yeah.
It's complicated. I'm not a geneticist, but I've worked with a lot, and I've sort of learned about this concept over time. So what you can do is measure whether or not there's a change in the amount of these methyl groups that are attached to the code, the DNA code. And the reason why geneticists are interested in this is because methyl groups play this incredibly important role of opening up the DNA like helix to be read so that you can make certain enzymes, for example. Or it coils it up really tight so the genetic code can't be read, so something doesn't get made. Now, neither is good or bad, and that's something that I've been, has been certainly taught to me, that it's not that being methylated or unmethylated is good or bad, but that it does change activity. And sometimes that's an important thing to have happen, and sometimes it might not be an important thing to have happen. But the concept here was that what we looked at was whether or not giving people the additional nutrients, of which some of them are methylated, so the B12 is methylated, as one example, and folate is methylated, that having those additional methyl groups on the nutrients that people were consuming, it did change the amount of methylation associated with the DNA structure. And so seeing that really small scale changes happening with the additional micronutrients was really exciting. It was small, and the geneticist said, this is a really, really tiny effect. It's present probably across the entire genome. But the fact that we had this, but we showed and proved that there was a biological effect was really, really exciting. The second thing that we did was that we have looked at the microbiome, and we've looked at microbiome samples of kids with ADHD who either were taking micronutrients or were taking placebo. And we looked at them before they started taking the nutrients or the placebo, and we looked at them after, about 10 weeks afterwards. And we looked to see whether or not there was an effect on the microbiome. And a really exciting thing that we observed was that the diversity of the bacteria in the guts of the kids who were exposed to the micronutrients increased. And the research suggests that diversity of your microbiome is good and important. And so going back to what I was saying before around the probiotics, that giving one strain actually doesn't make any sense, because you need a diverse number of bacteria. So to observe that, it was a small sample, and it's a pilot, and it's the first ever of someone looking at this. So it was a really interesting discovery, and based on our research. But we need to see it replicated, and we need to see what other labs show. And I know there's some people in the States who are now looking to see whether or not they observe the same thing. And so once we have more a bigger sort of data set and more observations, then we might have a bit more confidence that this might be one of the reasons, this might be one of the ways that the micronutrients are having their effect, is that they're having an effect on the bacterial strains, the diversity of the microbiome, and that in turn increases the health of the gut. It influences the bidirectional communication with the brain. I mean, it's just a really complex web of things that might be happening. So going back to the expensive urine, I can really confidently say that this is not expensive urine, that it is definitely having an effect in multiple different ways that we have been able to detect. So that's exciting.
Because of the bioavailability, isn't it? Because it really is getting
Something's
there.
happening.
It's getting there, isn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely getting in.
Okay.
It's definitely getting through the gut lining in order to have these effects, because otherwise you wouldn't detect it.
Well, I have to tell you, Julia, I think that for you to stand up to society that has led to believe something opposite to what you've proven, you and Bonnie have proven over the years, is quite profound.
Thank you.
And we are grateful, and we're really thankful for this book that we are using as a resource and helping other people to get educated and have this paradigm shift. That's what we're after right now, is helping other people to have the paradigm shift as well. So we're so grateful that you're in the UK and that you're able to spend time in this time zone with us this evening.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure.
Your work is changing so many lives. It's true. I think people need to get it more, read more, familiarize with all the kind of, availabilities of what can they do, and need to actually change their diets. Probably,
yes,
most
definitely.
importantly.
Were there any
I think
questions?
we've offered really, some really huge hope to a lot of people. I mean, it's a lot of hope, and hopefully they will restore the mental resilience, that they'll take this on board, that they'll return to a health where they feel like they're back to an optimal level rather than the sluggish level.
I hope so. Can I see if there's any other questions from the audience, the other people who have been listening in?
No one typed anything.
No.
Anybody want to type or come off of mute? I can unmute. You can unmute yourself. You can actually unmute yourself.
No.
No one wants to. Okay.
I just wanted to say thank you, because it's really got me thinking about so many things, actually, and so many links that you mentioned, especially the early conversation around nutrients linking to alcohol and sleep, those two things, which I think are very prevalent in our society. And I think that is something that a lot of adult working people in the UK need to have a look at, as we spend a lot of time in pandemic times where the alcohol consumption has gone up, the stress levels have gone up, the nutrient levels have obviously gone down. I'm really quite excited to read this book, Julia, so thank you for this evening.
Oh, you're welcome.
Stimulating.
Thanks, Gemma. Anybody else? You can take yourself off mute by clicking the mute button. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you as well. My mum lent me the book, and my mum made me the energy bars, and we all love them.
Oh,
So
good.
it started, but yeah, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. It's nice to meet you.
You too.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Anybody else? Annie? Lisa? Anyone else with questions? You can just click your unmute button, which is the microphone. You just have to click on it. I know Zoom is new to a lot of people as well. Anyone else? No?
No problem.
Julia, thank you ever so much.
You're very welcome. It's my pleasure.
Thank you so much for your time. And
thank you, everybody. You can share this. It's recorded, so you can share it.
Okay. All right. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
All the best.
Bye-bye.